Good evening and welcome to Chasing the Facts. Our guest this evening is Mike Rigney,
Hi, Sam.
who is obviously a Chelmsford resident and has served the town well. He's been a town meeting rep, he's been on the school committee and whatever else you've done. Could you give us a brief biographical sketch before we get into our conversation?
Yes, I am a new empty nester. The kids are all out of the house.
Congratulations.
We're living in the center and enjoying that quite a lot. It's a wonderful town. It's a wonderful place to be. And once we can go out in public again and mingle freely, I think we'll have a very good time.
I certainly hope so. I think we're getting to that point. So let's just keep our fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. And masks on.
So this evening I asked Mike to come on the show because he is an abutter, or a near abutter, I would say, a near abutter to the proposed Center Village project, which is presently under consideration by our planning board. And this has become quite controversial. And right now the planning board is in the midst of hearings, and at some point they will be making a decision. I don't know if that will come tonight or maybe at a subsequent meeting, but I think we're fairly close.
I think we are too. Based on some of the conversation at the Housing Advisory Board yesterday, I don't believe they'll be making a final decision tonight. They are still waiting on a letter from the Housing Advisory Board, but the Housing Advisory Board has been advised that the Planning Board may close the public debate on the special permit tonight, and if that's the case, then the Housing Advisory Board would have a short cycle, probably meet next week to provide a letter so that all the T's are crossed and I's are dotted. I believe the Planning Board has 30 days for consideration after closing the public hearing, but I assume they would want to dispense with it sooner rather than later. I think the most likely thing is that we'll see the public hearing close tonight and a decision at the next planning
meeting.
board.
Okay. So Mike, why don't you take just a minute and from your perspective, and you're a fair-minded guy, so I know it'll be an accurate rendition, just give us what you think the background of this project is and why we find ourselves at this point in somewhat of a controversial situation.
Well, the basic problem is the condition of the Oddfellows and the Fisk House. I think everybody who lives in this town would like to see the Oddfellows restored. They'd like to see the Fisk House be a functioning building once again. The company that owns the property, Americal, I believe they're based in California.
West Coast, right.
They're a holding company, and they've owned the property for about 20 years. For quite a while, it was tied up with a lease to Santander. The Santander lease essentially controlled the entire site, so there really wasn't anything to be done. You'll recall, there's a small Santander branch there now, the drive-through bank, but before that, the Oddfellows was being used as a bank for a number of years. It's been now, what, 10 years though, that it's been
it's longer than that.
Vacant,
yeah, longer than
and
that.
There are concerns about the interior condition. The town has tried at various points to reach out to Americal and try to provoke some kind of work there. I believe it came before the Board of Selectmen at one point, but they weren't able to make any progress. The thing that happened a few years ago, probably 2 years ago now, was that the Santander lease rolled over and was renegotiated. Santander didn't need all the space. They just wanted the drive-through bank, and that allowed for development or redevelopment of the majority of the site. So the question is, what can you do with that site? This has been a topic of interest. Again, going back, 1998 is one of the first documents that I'm aware of discussing a plan for the Center Village itself. I suspect it goes back farther than that. And Jim Lane, back around 2012, I believe, established the Center Village Master Plan Committee, or was tapped to lead the Center Village Master Plan Committee. They did a fantastic job, wrote a really great report. It's 300 or 400 pages long. They did a really deep dive. They had multiple public input sessions. They worked with traffic consultants. They worked with architectural consultants, and they really tried to work out what the town wanted to see in the center. I would say the centerpiece of that project was the Brook Walk vision. And what was envisioned with the Brook Walk was a continuous path running from Summer Street through the center and all the way up to connecting to the rail trail up by Bartlett Woods. So if that vision had come to fruition, it would have really done a fantastic job of increasing the walkability and bikeability of the downtown. There's a nice neighborhood over where Summer Street kind of curves around. There's a number of houses back there. Those people would have had walking access.
That's
to,
my neighborhood.
To the downtown.
Full disclosure, my neighborhood.
It's a beautiful little.
Yes.
It's a beautiful little area. And you can walk now. It's not impossible. But the vision of having a boardwalk along the river or along the Beaver Brook is really a compelling one, especially if it lets you connect out to the rail trail, to Bartlett Woods. There were people who got very excited about that. There are a number of problems with that vision, it turns out. The most significant one, and it's only really become apparent lately, is that the DEP does not think it's a good idea to let human beings interact with rivers. And I think this has been made pretty clear through the work that the applicant on this project has done with the Conservation Commission. There are some other practical issues as well. There's a small boardwalk that I think John Harrington built behind his place that begins the connection from Summer Street.
Correct.
The plan was then to continue that along on that side of the river and to cross over somewhere around the Oddfellows building. The problem is there's really a dramatic increase in height as you get past Harrington's into the old Stop and Shop
It is.
plaza.
It's quite a drop.
It's not realistic to put a bridge or a pathway across that. So then you can maybe switch it to the other side of the brook, which is our property, and continue it on. But that's also, basically the ground is not firm. What John built was basically floating pontoons. It's a very simple bridge, it's very light on the environment, but it's unusable 3-4 months of the year. It's buried in snow or underwater. That problem extends all the way out on the other side of town as well. If you try to walk along Beaver Brook, once you get past the Chelmsford Card and Gift Shop, it's a very broad floodplain,
Right.
and it's just really impassable most of the year.
So that particular vision didn't work out for very many reasons. And then we had the underlying zoning, which existed, and then 6 or 7 years ago, the town meeting approved an overlay district, VCOD, Village Center Overlay District. And what happens with an overlay is it does not negate the underlying zoning, but it allows for additional flexibility to whatever the zoning restrictions are, to allow for things that might not otherwise be allowed to be done without the overlay district. So we have that situation. And that's where we are today, as far as I understand it, as far as the regulatory situation for that particular parcel. So with that as a backdrop, continue with why you feel that this particular project is problematic.
Well, the problem really lies in the Village Center Overlay District language. It was in part at least modeled on the economic district language, which had been approved by town meeting a few years before. The VCOD came forward, I think, in spring of 2014 or 2015. Interestingly enough, there's a note in the Center Village Master Plan that work was done in part with the support of Howard Stein Hudson. Howard Stein Hudson is now part of the group that is proposing this new project. And in the VCOD, what you find is a clause right at the end that allows for alternative compliance. It says, in order to encourage creativity, diversity, and best practices for public and private design in the development of the VCOD, the planning board may waive, modify, or vary standards for building and lot types, parking, landscaping, and open and civic space types as set forth by the bylaw. Essentially, what it does is wipe away any underlying zoning at all. It gives the planning board the power to completely rewrite the zoning.
That language is very clear. I would not say that that is subject to too much interpretation. I think it is very clear. I think it sounds like it does what you just said it does.
It doesn't exist anywhere else.
Right.
It's not in the economic development overlay, and it's not in the model language promulgated by the state for village center overlay districts.
So in my experience, and in my professional life, I dealt extensively with regulations. In my experience, when a regulation is written that way, generally speaking, the people who write those expect people to exercise reasonable discretion. Okay? But there is no compulsion requiring them to do that. We expect people to be reasonable, and of course that's a subjective standard, and what's reasonable to you may not be reasonable to me. So I think maybe that's part of the problem that we're facing today.
That's part of the problem that we're facing. I think more broadly it removes any kind of reasonable expectations of abutters or other people in the area. When we bought the house that we live in now, we didn't do a deep dive into the language, but we did kind of look around and see. We understood that there was a parking lot back there that at some point might become something else. But if you look at the building dimensions and sizes laid out in the VCOD, it's 3 stories by right and 35 feet. The building that's being proposed is 65 feet tall. It far exceeds
almost
anything
double
else
the height of the by right use.
Of the by right use, and really bigger than anything else in the area. It is modeled on the Gristmill 1 project, which was itself rather controversial for its height, but in fact the building is much bigger because at Gristmill 1 they were able to dig down underneath into the bedrock and put a parking garage down there. As we've noted, the parking lot there is basically a floodplain. And so they are going, in fact, they're going to have to...
So the parking is on grade, and then your first story will be really your second story.
Yes.
Yeah.
So to get the same number of units.
Right.
There's only, it's still only 32 units, but 65 feet tall.
Now, what about the footprint of the project with respect to what is contemplated in the VCOD, setbacks and things like that?
Well, yeah, so again, it does not meet the setbacks that are envisioned in the village center overlay tables and language. It also doesn't meet the unit density. For multifamily developments are allowed by right 4 units. This is 32 units. It's a vast expansion of what's envisioned and what was brought before town meeting. Now, you can say that town meeting should have read the language a little bit more closely, and I'm as guilty as anyone. I was actually a member of town meeting at the time that this was brought forward, and I have to confess I did not perceive the implications of this clause that basically allow the planning board to rewrite all the zoning on the fly. So that's where we are now. Developers have found that language and they are using it to put a very large multifamily unit into a place where it really, in my opinion, does not belong. You're putting 5 stories on top of a floodplain. If we had talked, my wife and I, early on in this process, that if they, and we said it at a meeting to them, if you would reduce it to 4, we'd probably go away. that's still big enough to kind of see from the backyard, but it doesn't tower over the trees, it doesn't tower over the other buildings. They refuse, though. They've insisted on keeping it at 5, and they say that that's because they can't make the project work economically without having those 5 stories. So then you need to look at the rest of the project. And what they began by saying was that they were going to renovate the Oddfellows and put a 100-seat steakhouse on the bottom floor, put 8 rental apartments above it, redo the Fisk House, renovate the Fisk House, and turn that into business offices, both of which seem perfectly reasonable uses. As this project has continued, though, the developer has backed away from those promises. And now the only thing they are promising to do for those 2 buildings are exterior renovations, no interior renovations. Even though the owner of the property was at the planning board meeting, I believe it was the prior one in January, to say that he had standing water in the basement and the Oddfellows building was at risk, and if action wasn't taken now, it was likely to fall into disrepair. John Harrington, at that same meeting, said he is concerned that that building has become a fire trap and that it's likely to burn down half the block, which I think would be of some concern to cut to the chase as well.
And that's Mr. Harrington's building.
It is his building. I guess I'm reassured a little bit on the one to find out that it's full of water, making it less likely to burn down half the block. But there's no question that the building is dilapidated and in serious need of repair. The applicant claims that the only way they can raise the funds to do the kind of repair that is needed is to build a 5-story luxury condominium on the same site.
So, okay, that brings up, and I think you've given a pretty good summary, that brings up a couple of questions. First of all, the question of zoning. I have some experience in this area, and I also have some feelings like everybody else does. And I am a proponent of adhering to zoning very strictly, because I feel that once you get zoning regulations in, that really is the community's expression of how an area ought to look, okay, for lack of more technical, a more technical way of describing that. So you've already got essentially a community statement, through your zoning regulations. That's not to say they can't change, but if they're going to change, then the normal process is for the planning board to propose a change, and then it goes to town meeting, and then town meeting adopts the change, and we're fine with that because that is the process. Okay, but this does not appear to be that. This appears to be some established zoning requirements, as you said, even in consideration of the overlay district, which makes some modification. But this appears to be way in excess of what anybody probably could have reasonably expected could be put on that property. You mentioned 4 units in terms of housing density. So we've gone from 4 to 32, okay? If a developer came in and said, I wanted to do 6 units, all right, maybe we think about that, okay? We have a height restriction. The underlying zoning says 35 feet. This is going to 65 feet. For whatever reason, it doesn't matter that, it's going to be 65 feet tall. All right, so if a developer comes in and says, hey, listen, your zoning says 35, geez, could I do 38? Well, maybe that's reasonable, and we give a waiver for that. But what we're talking about here, it seems to me, is an extraordinary variance to whatever the underlying zoning is. And I think that's what has got people upset. And the other thing that I think we need to talk a little bit about is the quid pro quo aspect of it. You've got the Fisk House and you've got the Oddfellows, and certainly nobody would tell you that the Oddfellows is a visually pleasing building to look at. And how legitimate is it to say, well, gee, we'll renovate these 2 buildings for you if you allow us to do something that really is unrelated to the renovation of these 2 buildings? So if you want to expand
Well,
on that.
yeah, so there's
Okay.
there's a couple of points I'd like to make there. First, talking about the zoning, it is very much an expression of the community's vision, and that's why it's important that zoning changes go before town meeting. Short of direct democracy, town meeting is probably the most representative form of government in the U.S., and it gives everybody a chance to have a say. It's something I also want to reiterate. When Jim Lane and the Center Village Master Plan Committee did their work, they felt it was very important to reach out and get community input. They may not have had a lot of people show up at the meetings.
It wasn't for lack of trying,
but
though.
they tried.
Yes,
and
they did.
They really
They
did,
did.
and that matters. And so what's happening here now, in contrast to that, is a process that has taken place almost entirely in silence. There's been, this has been going on basically during the COVID era. So there haven't really been any public meetings. Everything's been over Zoom. And there hasn't, while there's been a little bit of public input at the last meeting or two, this has not been widely broadcast to the community. Another point is the idea of having changes to your zoning, right? It would be, in a perfect world, yes, everything would be done by right. There are really, though, I think we can all admit that, nothing is cookie cutter. Every circumstance is a little bit different, and a reasonable zoning code should allow for some variations. There are two major categories, it seems to me, in zoning of those variations. One would be a special permit, and the other would be a variance or a waiver. And they kind of go in different directions. Typically, a special permit is required in a situation where there's an envisioned use which may be obnoxious to other people in or near the zone. And so what happens is the applicant is held to a higher standard. They're allowed to build a building, but they have to do some extra work. And that is designed to give the community a chance to have some input into it and to express just how strongly they feel about whether this is a good or bad idea. A variance kind of goes the other way. It loosens it's a way of loosening the restrictions of the zoning code. Once again, typically that's done, in Chelmsford it's done more often than not by the ZBA, but it's still a public process. And there was a story in probably the Globe, I don't know, a year or two ago. One of those just little quick hitters that's designed to infuriate you and you move on. And it was all about how the developers in Boston were just having their way with the Boston ZBA. The Boston ZBA was approving something like 95% of all variances requested. So I read the story, I did what I was supposed to do, I got irritated, I got upset, and I decided, by golly, I'm gonna go check out and see if that's true in Chelmsford too. And I started reading through the ZBA minutes and the applications, and sure enough, they were granting almost every variance requested. And so my blood pressure went up some more until I started reading the minutes. And in virtually every case where the variance was granted, it was because it was a situation where abutters provided letters of support.
Correct.
In almost every case, it's somebody who's trying to build a deck or a garage that's a little bit closer to the boundary line than it should be
You go to
by
your
the
neighbor and
zoning
you
code.
say, can I have the extra foot? And the
Which-
neighbor says, sure. And,
right.
okay, can you come to the ZBA meeting and speak on my behalf? That's usually the way
Which
it
is
works.
exactly how it's supposed
Exactly.
to work, right? We're supposed to be a community that works together. And so those are kind of the two models. This alternative compliance really doesn't fit either one. There are no additional requirements for a use that might be obnoxious, and there's really no need, at least in the alternative compliance methodology in the VCOD, for public or abutter support.
So I think you've given a very good overview of some of the issues. Now I'm going to go.
I'm sorry. You know what? You did mention the quid pro quo
Yeah, go ahead.
aspect of it, because, and I think that's an important.
Address
I think
that.
that's an important part of this,
Yep.
because obviously, there's a desire in this town to see the existing buildings renovated, and brought back to whatever their past glory may have been. And so the question is, how much leeway are we willing to give a developer on something like that? And this is where you have to, I think it's important for the planning board to be given full and complete information by the project developer about what exactly it is that they intend to do. Again, there's a difference between saying, if you let me build this multifamily unit, I will put a 100-seat steakhouse in the Oddfellows. Mm-hmm. Or, if you let me build this building, all I'm going to do is change the siding on the Oddfellows. And this applicant has gone from one story to another. They began by saying that it was going to be a steakhouse, mm-hmm. and now it is just exterior renovations. Mm-hmm. Same thing with the Fisk House. If the planning board can't get reliable information, I don't know how it can judge the value of the quid for the quo that it's being asked to give.
Exactly.
There's another aspect of this, which is the inclusionary zoning bylaw. Mm-hmm. Based on the size of the proposed development, the proponent has asked to be allowed, first of all, to make a payment in lieu of actually providing affordable housing in those buildings. The planning board has a formula for what an appropriate payment in lieu of is. For this project, the appropriate payment in lieu of would be $1.1 million. Mm-hmm. The applicant is suggesting that they are willing only to pay $360,000, and that anything more than that is going to make the project unreasonably expensive, and they won't be able to do it as considered. But they haven't provided any estimates of cost. There's no way to evaluate their claim.
So the planning board, in that particular scenario, the planning board would have to mitigate that and say, okay, you don't have to pay the full freight. We'll let you pay the whatever it is,
360, yeah.
360. So that's okay. So that's another.
But here's the problem: that location is ideal for low-income housing. Mm-hmm. It's right on a bus line, mm-hmm. right? It's right in the center of town. If you don't have a lot of income, and it's hard for you to get around, where better to live? What's essentially happening with the payment in lieu ofs is redlining. It's a little bit of a charged term, but if you were to say that, Jewish people or disabled people or red-haired people cannot live in the center in this development, that would be controversial. If you say low-income people can't live here, even though it really works better for them than pushing them out mm-hmm. somewhere else, that sadly does not seem to be that controversial. What it does do is force these low-income developments into other areas of the town, which may in many ways be less suitable than the current area. That also is something that ought to be taken into account by the planning board in deciding whether the deal being proposed is a reasonable deal mm-hmm. for the town.
I think that's very well stated, and quite frankly, I hadn't even thought of that aspect. But you're right; it does have that effect. So, Mike, you've got about a minute, and so what I want you to do is make your pitch to the camera as to why you feel this project is not appropriate for the area.
Well, essentially, it's for the reasons that we've already talked about. The village center overlay. One of the intents is to keep the character and form of the area. A 5-story residential building does not meet the character of the historic downtown of Chelmsford. It's that simple. In addition, I think there are multiple failures of the applicant to provide timely and reasonable information to the planning board to assist them in making their decision. I think the planning board needs to be very cautious about using this rather novel approach that wipes away the zoning, and it might be worth pointing out that the Village Center Overlay District is not confined just to the Oddfellows.
I wish we had a little bit more time to discuss this, but anyway, check out the planning board meetings. It's ongoing. We may have a decision in a couple of weeks, folks. Thank you very much.